Hello listeners. Mr. Bookman here. Before we get to today's story, subscribe to the channel and click the like button. You can now follow me on Facebook. The link is in the description. I just read that the average person spends 3 hours a day on their cell phones. Now everyone including you can use their cell phones to make $25 or even up to $50 an hour with social media jobs. No experience required to work your own hours from anywhere in the world. Click the link in the description to start making money right now. Now let's dive right into today's book.
Section 16 of The Cruise of the Scandal and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cruise of the Scandal and Other Stories by Victor Bridges. The Nadir Bandar. I had known Bruce for about 15 years before this amazing thing happened. He was a nephew of Mervyn Bruce, the famous traveller, and we had turned up the same day at Haileybury, 2 forlorn new boys. I can see him now with his shock of red hair, his friendly grin, and that funny little habit of scratching the back of his right ear, which has never left him. He came up and spoke to me in the quad. Some big fellow had just asked me my name, and when in all innocence I had said, "Bridges, what's yours?" I had been answered with a clip over the head that had sent me sprawling on the asphalt. "Why did he hit you?" asked Bruce. I explained, trying not to blubber. "You'll know him again, won't you?" said Bruce. I nodded. "That's all right," he said cheerfully. "Then you can poison his food." I remember this struck me as being a very comforting reflection, and from that moment Bruce and I have always been the best of friends. Later on we shared a study together, the corner study next the big school, and one summer holiday I went and stayed with his people in that big ivy-covered house near Goring that you can see from the railway line. When we left school our paths separated for a time. I started at journalism in London, while Bruce was sent to France to learn the language. I think his father had some idea that he would make a good Prime Minister. When the old man died, Bruce came home and settled in London. He had come into about £800 a year, and had no intention at all of going into politics. Since then we've always seen a good deal of each other. He's just about the same cheery, irresponsible, adventurous, good-natured chap that he was at school. I don't think we ever had anything approaching a quarrel in our lives. I've told you all this so that you can see exactly what sort of people we are. It's really quite unnecessary, because you won't believe my story in any case. Still, unless Bruce and I are insane, the thing really happened, and as there is absolutely no reason to suppose we are, I intend to tell it and get it off my chest. I will begin right at the beginning. It was on the 9th of February that I first learned of Mervyn Bruce's death. I saw it in the Daily Mail while I was having breakfast. There was a portrait of him in rough shooting clothes and a cork helmet. It must have been taken many years before, and a full column about his life and adventures. He had died at Etretat, where the paper said he had been living for some time. I didn't bother myself about it, because I knew that he and Bruce had not been on speaking terms for years. There had been some silly family squabble somewhere back in the dark ages, and the old explorer was one of those fatuous people who think it a point of honour to keep a thing like that up forever. So after making an ineffectual attempt at a reconciliation when he was in France, Bruce had simply let matters slide. I was therefore a little surprised to get a line from him on the 11th, saying that he was just off to Etretat to see about his uncle's funeral. "The fact is," he wrote, "the old chap had quarrelled with everyone by the time he died, and as I'm his nearest relation I suppose I ought to see him through. I shall be back by the end of the week." It was 6 days before I heard anything more. Then late on Tuesday evening I received a wire from him at the office. "Please come, Hampstead, tomorrow, lunch. Important." Bruce lives in one of those old-fashioned 3-story houses way to the right off the top of Haverstock Hill. I expect you know them if you've ever been up in that direction. Standing back from the road with balconies, long windows, and creeper-covered fronts, they seem to shrink in a kind of desolate dismay from the new red brick splendour which has gradually hemmed them in. Heath View, the end one, is where Bruce hangs out. It belongs to an ex-police sergeant and his wife called Jones, and Bruce has the whole of the 2 top floors. They make him very comfortable, but I have often wondered why he doesn't take a flat. He says it is because Mrs. Jones is the only woman in London who can cook a mushroom omelette. When I rang the bell, the possessor of this unique talent opened the door herself. She's a tall, good-looking woman of about 40, with that sort of grave, respectful manner you don't often meet nowadays. Yes, Mr. Bruce was in, she said, and expecting me. Would I go straight up? Bruce heard me coming and flung open the door. He had just jumped up from his desk, which was littered with papers and bundles of deeds tied up by red tape. He looked flushed and a little excited. "Come along in," he said. "I was just beginning to be afraid you couldn't turn up." I discarded my coat and followed him into the room. "I couldn't neglect such a poignant wire," I said. "What's the matter? Have you come into a fortune?" He laughed in a curious, jerky sort of way, and just then Mrs. Jones came in and began to lay the table for lunch. As soon as she'd gone down again, Bruce walked across to the fireplace and threw down his cigarette in the grate. "I didn't get any money," he said abruptly. "The old chap left every cent he had to Reardon, the man who published his book of travels." "I should dispute the will," I said. "An author who leaves money to a publisher is obviously mad." Bruce scratched his ear for a moment in silence. "I've got something else, though," he said at last. Then he stepped to his desk, pulled open the drawer, and took out a small, dark green object. "What do you make of it?" he said, handing it to me. I took it and crossed to the window so as to get it in a better light. I'm not a particularly impressionable person, but when I saw it at close quarters I, as nearly as possible, dropped it. "Good heavens!" I said. "What a loathsome thing! What is it? A monkey or a devil?" Bruce laughed uneasily. "It's the Nadir Bandar," he said. At that moment the door opened and Mrs. Jones came in again with a mushroom omelette. I stuffed the infernal piece of jade away in my pocket, and we sat down at the table. It was not until she had shut the door behind her that I took it out. "And what the devil is the Nadir Bandar when it's at home?" I asked, setting the horrible thing up on the tablecloth in front of me. Bruce laid down his fork and, putting his hand in his pocket, pulled out a couple of sheets of dirty folded foolscap. "You'd better read that," he said. I took them with no little curiosity. They were written in a very fine, sloping hand, and were headed, "An account of the finding of the Nadir Bandar, not to be published until after my death. Mervyn Bruce." Here is the whole thing as it was written. I first heard of the Nadir Bandar when I was at Nick in '73. I was told of it by the Sheikh Al-Abbas, who claimed himself to be descended from Nadir Shah. Al-Abbas had been wounded in the rebellion against Nasr ed-Din and had fled to Nick, where I found him dying and in disguise. I took him into my house and looked after him as well as I could, for the man was a great man of noble blood and not an accursed Turkish dog like Nasr ed-Din. On the night before he died he spoke to me of the Nadir Bandar. If I had it, he said, I would wish to be well, and I would also wish that Nasr ed-Din should be eaten of worms. Myself: "What is the Nadir Bandar, Sheikh Al-Abbas? I have not heard of it." The Sheikh: "There is but one who has heard of it, and he will die with the coming of the sun." Myself: "It is a great power if it can grant such wishes as you name." The Sheikh: "There is no wish that it cannot grant. 4 times may a man call upon it, and 4 times will it answer. With its aid my ancestor Nadir Shah conquered the entire world." Myself: "If he possessed such a power, Sheikh Al-Abbas, why did he allow himself to be slain?" The Sheikh: "4 times had he called on it, and 4 times had it answered." Myself: "You mean that its power had passed away?" The Sheikh: "He had buried it at the meeting of the waters. His last wish had been that he might win the world and gain the mountain of light. When this was granted he buried it beneath the great sunstone at the meeting of the waters. After that he was slain." Myself: "And where is the meeting of the waters, Sheikh Al-Abbas?" The Sheikh: I cannot say. All that I know I was told by my father, who had had it from his father before him. When I rose next morning, the Sheik Alabas was dead. I buried him, pondering greatly over his story. Some would have dismissed it from their minds as the babbling of a dying man, but I have seen many strange things in this world, and I knew well that the Sheik Alabas had spoken what he believed to be true. So soon as I could get away from Nick in safety, I travelled through to Quetta, and there, procuring a map, I traced out the marches of Nadir Shah as he came back from the ravishing of Delhi. So far as I could see, there was but one place to which the phrase used by the Sheik Alabas could be applied. That was a few miles to the east of Jalalabad, where the Chitral and Kabul rivers mingle together and flow down to the Great Lakes. I made my way up to Peshawar, and in the disguise of an Afghan hillman crossed the border. At Lalpura I fell in with a travelling merchant who was in much fear of being waylaid by robbers. "Two," said he, "are better company than one," and together we set out on the road to Jalalabad. We passed through Kila Akunt before the sun was high in the sky, and halted for our midday rest on the bank of the Kabul river. It was there that I learned of the temple of the Sunstone. It stood before us at the meeting of the waters, a low stone building set on an island in midstream. When my companion spoke of it by its name, my heart leaped suddenly within me, for I recalled the words of the Sheik Alabas. "It is very sacred," said my companion. "No one but the priests of the sun are allowed to enter or even to land on the island." I made no reply to him, and later on we continued our journey to Jalalabad, where we parted. That night I rode out from the city and tied up my horse in a thicket on the bank of the river opposite to the temple. Then, stripping myself of my clothes, I entered the water and swam to the island, having some matches and a loaded pistol in my turban. These I took out on landing and advanced very carefully towards the gate of the temple. It was shut, and I could find no means of opening it save by breaking it in with a stone. This I did, waiting in some anxiety to see what might happen. There was no sound or movement, and I entered. The temple was quite dark inside, so halting and striking a match, I held it up above my head and looked about me. The floor was of beaten earth, and at the further end I beheld a large red stone, as red as blood, and guarded by golden rails. There were 2 candles, one each side, set in brass candlesticks. These I lighted, and then without more ado set to work digging out the earth under the stone with the aid of my knife. I must have laboured for the best part of an hour before the steel struck upon something hard, and the blade snapped in my hand. In another minute I had dragged to light an ancient iron box, which had rusted fully as red as the stone above. The cover fell off as I lifted it, and inside I beheld the Nadir Bandar. Scarcely had I taken it in my hand when the door of the temple opened. I looked up quickly. In the gloom I could see 3 figures, tall men, robed in white and carrying swords. I raised my pistol, but as I did so the words of the Sheik Alabas came flooding into my mind. "I wish," said I clearly, and without hesitation, "that I was in Peshawar." For a moment my eyes closed. When I opened them, I was standing outside the house in Peshawar where I had lately lodged. At this point I laid down the manuscript and burst into a shout of laughter. Bruce leaned across and picked it up. "You think it's all nonsense?" he said. "I think," said I, "that as an explorer your uncle can give points to Louis de Rougemont and Dr. Cook. The picture of him suddenly appearing naked in the main street of Peshawar with a pistol in one hand and the Nadir Bandar in the other is about the richest touch of imagination I've ever struck." "Do you think it's all a lie?" persisted Bruce. I stared at him. "My dear chap," I said, "it's either a lie or else the old boy was as mad as a March hare. Considering he left his money to a publisher, I personally incline to the latter theory." Bruce sat silent for a minute, scratching his ear. Then he laughed in a rather apologetic sort of fashion. "You'll think I'm dotty too," he said, "but do you know, upon my soul, I believe there's something in it." "Oh, get out," I said, "and pass me the whisky." Bruce handed over the bottle. I'm not joking, he went on obstinately. I've got a funny sort of feeling that the old chap was speaking the truth. You ought to take something for it, I said. Mother Siegel or Dr. Williams' pink pills for neurotic nephews. Bruce got up, and crossing to the mantelpiece, began to fill a pipe. For some moments we both remained silent. Well, look here, he broke out at last rather awkwardly. I'm going to have a wish and see what happens. I shook my head with a kind of mock disapproval. You're sure to be sorry, I said. These things always turn out badly. Think of Uncle Peter's fairy story. What's that? Asked Bruce. It's a book, I replied. A book that delighted my early childhood. As far as I can recollect, everyone in it was allowed to have one wish, and the results were, well, not quite what they expected. I remember one kind-hearted lady wishing that the blacksmith's baby, who was dying of consumption, should be as well and strong as its father. In about 3 minutes the baby was decimating the village with a sledgehammer. I shall be very careful, remarked Bruce, a little uncomfortably. By the way, I interrupted, what happened to your uncle? You took away his manuscript before I'd finished it. He never had any more wishes, said Bruce. The first shot seems to have frightened him off it. I laughed. I don't wonder, I said. One experience like that would be enough to make me sign the pledge forever. Bruce came to the table and picked up the Nadir Bandar. What are you going to wish? I asked mischievously. For goodness' sake, be careful. It's all right, he answered. I've got 4 wishes, so I can always unwish one if it goes wrong. Then he paused. I wish, he said, very slowly and distinctly, that I may be irresistible to all women. I burst out laughing. Good heavens, I said, you've done it now. Think what will happen if you run up against a girls' school. What on earth made you wish that? An obstinate look came into Bruce's face. It's Cynthia, he said. Cynthia West, you know. I want to marry her, and she won't give up the stage. Well, you needn't have indulged in quite such a sweeping demand, I protested. Bruce looked a little ashamed. I thought I'd be on the safe side, he explained. You see, I might get tired of Cynthia one day, and then it would save wasting a second wish. Well, I'm blessed, I said. For a lover, I think you're about the most cold-blooded cynic I ever struck. What are you going to wish next? I must have some money, Bruce said thoughtfully. You must, I agreed. Plenty. 800 a year won't go far with Cynthia, to say nothing of the others. What about $1 billion in consols? Suggested Bruce. I shook my head. Too much, I said. Think what the Clarion and Reynolds would say about it. You'd have no peace. I know, exclaimed Bruce suddenly. I'll wish that I had as much money as John P. Fox, the American rubber king. That ought to see you through all right, I remarked approvingly. The papers say he's worth $6 millions. Bruce again held up the Nadir Bandar. I wish, said he, that I had as much money as John P. Fox, the American rubber king. 2 up and 1 to play, I said, laughing. You may as well have a third while you're about it. That will still leave you 1 to hedge with. Bruce thought a moment. I wish that I may live forever, he said. Good, I cried. You'll be able to read Hall Caine's next novel right through. With this hopeful reflection, I got up from my chair and walked to the window. Now this tomfoolery's over, I observed with a yawn. What are we going to do? Bruce scratched his ear. I shall go and call on Cynthia, I think, he said in a rather apologetic voice. After all, you know, he added lamely, there might be something in it. Superstition, I began, when coupled with... Then I stopped abruptly. The excellent aphorism that I was about to utter was never completed. What's up? Asked Bruce, turning to me in surprise. I pointed to the door of the room. Look at that, I said. It was opening, slowly and stealthily, without a sound. We stared at it in amazement. Who's there? Called out Bruce sharply. There was a moment's pause, and then, very quietly, Mrs. Jones slipped into the room and shut the door behind her. She was breathing quickly, and her face was curiously flushed. For several seconds we all three stood facing each other. Then Bruce spoke. "What's the matter, Mrs. Jones? Are you ill?" he asked. The woman made no reply. With her eyes half closed, she rocked slowly from side to side as if about to fall. "Look out!" I cried. "She's going to faint." We both sprang forward together, but Bruce got there first and caught her by the shoulders. In a flash she had clutched him, winding her arms round his waist and burying her face in his coat with a little cry halfway between a laugh and a sob. For a moment Bruce was too dumbfounded to resist. Then, with frantic energy, he made a vain attempt to disentangle himself from her embrace. "Here, let me go," he stammered. "What are you doing? What's the matter? Pull her off, Bridges, pull her off." I hastened to his assistance, feeling as if I was taking part in some exceptionally spirited nightmare. To and fro we swayed, pulling, struggling, and banging against the table. At last, with a mighty heave, I managed to unfasten one of her hands, and ducking down, Bruce tore himself free. "She's mad," he gasped. "Shove her outside and lock the door. Quick!" "Well, give us a hand, then," I panted, for the woman was twisting and writhing in a manner that made it almost impossible to hold her. Watching his opportunity, Bruce leaped in and seized her disengaged wrist. She fought furiously, but together we half pushed, half carried her into the passage, and then, wrenching ourselves loose, leapt back into the room and slammed and locked the door. I sank down on the sofa and gazed at Bruce, who leaned against a table, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief. Presently he found his voice. "Lord," he muttered in an awestruck whisper, "I never thought the darned thing would work like this." That revived me. "Don't be an idiot," I cried sharply. "You don't suppose it's got anything to do with your beastly green monkey? The wretched woman's gone clean off her head. Something must be done at once." At that moment there came a savage hammering on the panels of the door. "I know what I'm going to do," exclaimed Bruce hastily, "and that's get out of the window. She'll have Jones up in a moment if she goes on like that, and the man's as jealous as Satan. He'd kill me for a certainty before I had time to explain." "Well, I'm not going to be left here with a couple of gibbering lunatics," I protested, jumping up from the sofa. He caught me by the sleeve. "Come on, then. We can get out on the balcony and climb down by the ivy. Anything's better than waiting for Jones." By this time I was so bewildered that I think I should have fallen in with any suggestion, however ludicrous. I remember some vague wonder passing through my mind as to what the next door people would think if they saw us swarming down the front of the house, but with the door threatening to yield every instant before Mrs. Jones's frantic assault, there was no opportunity for detached reflection. Grabbing my hat from the table, I followed Bruce out onto the balcony, shutting the window behind me. One glance up and down showed us that the road was empty. "You go first," I said unselfishly. "You're in most danger." He climbed the rail, and, clutching the stems of the ivy with both hands, slid off into space. Leaning over, I watched him swaying downwards in short, spasmodic jerks. Suddenly, from within the room came the crash of a splintering panel. "Look out!" I yelled hurriedly. "I'm coming!" And scrambling over the rail, I too committed myself to that inadequate creeper. I know that in books of adventure people swarm up and down an ivy-clad house without the faintest inconvenience, but as one who's tried it, I can only say that it's about the most poisonously impossible feat ever attempted. Bruce was luckier than I. He was within 4 feet of the ground when the stuff gave way. I must have fallen at least 12, and I landed in a rose bush. Bruce, who had scrambled to his feet, rushed up and pulled me out of the wreckage. "Hurt?" he inquired eagerly. "Oh, no," I replied with some bitterness, "not in the least. I love to come down sitting on a rose bush. It's a kind of hobby of mine." We had no time to squabble, however. Before Bruce could answer, we heard the window above flung violently open and the furious panting of Mrs. Jones as she climbed out onto the balcony. That was enough. With incredible celerity, we dashed for the garden gate and nearly killed ourselves trying to get out at the same moment. Then, turning to the right, we raced down the road towards Haverstock Hill. We must have covered at least half the distance before I regained sufficient sanity to realize what we were doing. Then I clutched Bruce by the arm. "Steady on," I gasped. "If there's anyone looking they'll think we're mad." Even as I spoke there came a sharp "Toof! Toof!" and instinctively we pulled up. Round the corner of Fitzjohn Villas bowled a solitary taxi, the driver leaning back comfortably in his seat and smoking a big cigar. "Hi!" we yelled in unison. Some note of unusual urgency in our summons must have attracted him, for he at once applied his brakes. Having done this, however, he recollected himself, and, removing his cigar, spat pleasantly in the roadway. "Nothing doing, governor," he said with a kind of gloomy satisfaction. "Just off to the garage." "You must," I said desperately. "We're in a hurry. We can't wait. I'll give you a sovereign." "A sovereign?" he repeated dully. "Where do you want to go?" "Piccadilly Circus," I blurted out. It was the first place that came into my head. He stared at me, and then something like a look of sympathy crept into his face. "Ah!" he said. "Get in." For about 3 minutes after the taxi started neither of us spoke. Then Bruce broke the silence. "Well," he said, "do you believe it now?" I turned on him angrily. "Look here," I cried, "don't talk blithering rot. The thing's impossible. You know it as well as I do." He shook his head. "Well, what about Mrs. Jones?" he said obstinately. "Mrs. Jones," I repeated, "is the victim of the same disease that you're suffering from, common or garden hysteria. No doubt she was listening at the door and overheard your tomfool nonsense with that ridiculous monkey. Being a highly strung, passionate sort of woman—" Bruce cut me short. "Jones," he said, "is always complaining that she's too cold." "Cold!" I groaned. "Oh, Lord! So it couldn't be that," he added. "Well, if it isn't that," I said, "what the blazes is it? You don't seriously expect me to believe in black magic and mumbo-jumbo and all that sort of bunkum, do you?" Bruce scratched his ear. "I don't know," he said unhappily. We sat in silence as the cab ran on, each of us staring out of the window on our respective sides. It was not until we were halfway up Tottenham Court Road that I suddenly noticed the time. There was a big clock outside one of the furniture shops, and the hands were pointing to 2:30. I called Bruce's attention to the fact. "Cynthia won't have finished her lunch yet," I said. "We'd better get out at Piccadilly Circus and walk up. Or perhaps you'd rather go alone." "No," he answered eagerly. "I want you to come. You needn't stay, you know, but I'd like you to just come and see what happens." "All right," I said, with a laugh. "I may as well see you through, now I've begun. If Cynthia starts embracing you, I'll leave the room." "Oh, don't joke about it," said Bruce nervously. The cab swerved its way through the traffic in Piccadilly Circus and drew up with a jerk opposite Swan and Edgar's. We got out, and I handed the man a sovereign, which I had ready. He took it with a friendly smile. "Thank you, sir," he said, "and good luck." "It's my cab," said Bruce, as we turned into Regent Street. "Very well," I answered. "We won't fight about it. You can pay me as soon as your green monkey pushes along those 6 millions." By this time we were just opposite the entrance to the Piccadilly Hotel. As we passed, the door swung open, and a handsome woman dressed in a long sable cloak stepped out onto the pavement. In the roadway opposite, a liveried manservant was holding open the door of a smart electric brougham. At the sight of us she paused, and her lips parted in one of the sweetest smiles I've ever seen. We both took off our hats, but as Bruce made no attempt to stop, I walked on with him. "Who is she?" I whispered. He stared at me. "I don't know," he said. "I thought she was a friend of yours." "Never seen her in my life," I answered. "I wonder who she took us for." I looked round, then touched his arm. "Bruce," I said, "she's following us." He glanced back over his shoulder, and I saw him start as though something had stung him. "Come on," he muttered, suddenly quickening his pace. "Why? What does it matter?" I protested. "Others, too," he whispered. "Just behind her, 3 or 4 of them. It's that infernal charm." "Bosh!" I said incredulously, and then turned round to take another look. For a moment I felt as if someone had suddenly placed a large piece of ice inside my waistcoat. At least 5 women were following us along the pavement, headed by the lady in sables. There could be no possible doubt about it. Even as I looked, 2 girls who had been walking in the other direction suddenly pulled up, and then turning round came hurriedly in pursuit of the rest. We seemed to be clearing Regent Street. "This is awful," I gasped. "What are we to do?" "We must take a taxi," stammered Bruce, looking wildly about him. Of course, as luck would have it, there was not a cab of any kind passing. We couldn't wait, for every moment things were growing worse. Women were appearing suddenly out of shops and hurrying over from the other side of the street in twos and threes, recklessly indifferent to the traffic. In less than a minute a jostling crowd of about 50 or 60 were sweeping after us up the pavement. "Run!" gasped Bruce. "Run!" It was, of course, about as mad a thing as we could have done, but panic, stark, blind panic, had gripped hold of us, and our only feeling was a frantic desire to escape. Without another word we took to our heels. Of what followed I have a somewhat confused recollection. I remember a terrific uproar all round us, yells of "Suffragettes! Stop 'em! Police!" and then 2 helmeted figures in dark blue suddenly leaped across our path. I suppose they must have taken us for cabinet ministers, for they opened out to let us go through, and without hesitation hurled themselves into the wild avalanche of pursuing women. The check was only a momentary one, but it saved us. Before the shattered column could reform, we had reached the corner of Vigo Street, where a taxi, a thrice blessed taxi with an excited, beckoning driver at the wheel, was standing in readiness. "Jump in!" he roared, as we hurled ourselves panting at the door. Willing hands banged it behind us. Someone raised a cheer as we sank back on the seat, and there we were, spinning past the Bodley Head, with the tumult and shouting dying away behind us. There are some emotions which words are quite inadequate to express. At that moment Bruce and I were suffering from about 6 of them. It was the taxi driver who first broke the silence. At the bottom of Bond Street he pulled up, and, projecting his head round the side of the cab, signified his desire to speak with us. Mechanically I pulled down the window. "The House of Commons, governor?" he inquired. "No," I said dully. "Cynthia's flat." He stared at me, and I recollected myself. "Manor Court, Marylebone Road," I observed harshly. He swung round, and we retraced our way up Bond Street. Just as we were emerging from the bottom of Harley Street, Bruce leaned across and laid his hand on my arm. "After I've seen Cynthia," he said brokenly, "I shall unwish that first wish." I nodded. The taxi drew up at the gate of Manor Court, and we got out. The driver looked at us with interest. "Just in time, I was," he observed. "They'd have had you in another minute." Bruce handed him half a sovereign. "Thank you, sir," he said. "Thank you." And he paused. "I knows what them suffragettes wants," he added, "and if I had my way I'd give it 'em." With this dark saying he slipped in his clutch and left us. Side by side we walked up the gravelled drive and stepped in through the main entrance. Cynthia's flat is on the ground floor on the right-hand side, the one with the green door and the copper knocker. Bruce laid his hand on the latter and then hesitated. "Go on," I said bitterly. "Think what we've been through." His face hardened, and he gave 2 sharp rat-tats. A minute's pause, a sound of footsteps, and then the door swung open. A pretty, dark girl in the dress of a parlour-maid was standing before us. Bruce cleared his throat. "Is Miss West at home?" he asked huskily. She looked at him curiously for a moment without replying, then suddenly she said, "Yes, sir," and stepped back from the door. We followed her into the hall, laying our hats and sticks on the table inside. Bruce's hands were shaking like leaves. Without looking at us, the girl led the way down the passage and opened a door on the left-hand side. "Will you please come in here, sir?" she said gently. Bruce, who was about 2 paces ahead of me, stepped in first. In a flash the girl had followed him, slamming the door in my face with a bang that echoed through the flat. I pulled up short, and as I did so there came a stifled cry from Bruce. "Help! Help! Bridges, help!" Flinging the door open again, I rushed in. As far as I could see, Bruce and the housemaid were engaged in a rather strenuous waltz. They were swaying down the room, wreathed in each other's arms, splendidly regardless of the furniture. Even as I entered, they fetched up against the end of the sofa and collapsed into a tangled heap. At that instant something heavy struck me violently in the back and sent me reeling against the wall. A big woman in a print dress, her arms covered with flour and a rolling pin in her hand, brushed violently past me. In 2 strides she reached the sofa, and seizing hold of the dark girl, began to drag her away from Bruce. If the latter's collar had not given way, he would certainly have been choked. As it was, the stud broke just in the nick of time. The 2 women reached the floor together with a loud thud, the rolling pin clattering away across the room. Next moment, collarless and dishevelled, Bruce was leaping for the door. I followed him, grabbing the handle and slamming it behind me. As luck would have it, there was a lock outside, and while Bruce snatched up his hat and fumbled with the front door, I turned the key with a savage force that broke it off short in my hand. Then, like 2 drunken men, we fell rather than staggered out into the main hall. Fortunately, there was no one about. Panting and exhausted, we leaned against the foot of the lift, while Bruce, by turning his collar up and brushing his coat with one hand, made a feeble attempt to regain some semblance of respectability. We were interrupted by the crunch of footsteps on the drive outside. "Look out," I whispered hastily, "there's someone coming." Bruce straightened himself just as a burly porter in uniform swung in through the doorway. He evidently recognized us as friends of Cynthia, for he saluted with a friendly but respectful smile. "Good day, gentlemen," he remarked. "I'm afraid Miss West ain't in town. Gone to Reigate, so I understand. Perhaps you've seen the parlour maid?" I nodded my head. "Yes," I said, "we have seen the parlour maid. Could you get us a cab?" "Certainly, sir. Taxi, sir?" "Doesn't matter," interrupted Bruce in a dazed voice, "as long as there are no women in it." I nudged him warningly, but the porter, evidently taking him for a humorist, laughed heartily. "Very well, sir," he said briskly, "I'll see to that, sir." Then, pulling a whistle from under his uniform, he stepped outside and blew a shrill blast. Almost immediately a taxi rolled up the drive. The porter opened the door, and as we came down the steps to get in, a small boy with a bundle of newspapers under his arm dashed up and thrust one out before me. "Here you are, sir. 2:30 winner. Death of a well-known millionaire, sir." "Push off, my lad," said the porter grandly. I had pulled a penny out of my pocket, however, before he spoke, and with an evening news in my hand I followed Bruce into the taxi. "Where to, sir?" inquired the porter. For a moment I was floored. "The Bachelors' Club," said Bruce, handing him a shilling. The porter saluted and passed on the instructions. "Bruce," I said dully, "do you realize what we're spending in cabs?" Bruce shook his head with an air of utter weariness. "It doesn't matter," he said. "I've got 6 million somewhere." Half an hour earlier I should have laughed. As it was, I only stared at him stupidly. "Yes," I said, "I suppose you have." Then, in a sort of mechanical way, I opened the paper. For a moment I gazed at it like a man in a trance. "What's the matter?" asked Bruce. I was past speaking. I could only point, with a trembling finger, to the 3 huge headlines which seemed to dance mockingly across the page. "Suicide of John P. Fox. Ruined rubber king blows out his brains. Pauper for the past 6 weeks." Bruce read them aloud in a strange, dry voice. Then he burst out into a horrid, cackling, mad sort of laugh. "That's done it!" he cried. "No money, and this nightmare of a day forever?" His voice rose to a scream. "I'm damned if I do!" he yelled. Thrusting his hand into his pocket, he pulled out the Nadir Bandar. "I wish," he sobbed, "that I'd never had a wish at all." End of section 16. Read by Sandra near Montreal. End of The Cruise of the Scandal and Other Stories by Victor Bridges.
Well, listeners, it looks like we have come to the end of the story. On your way out, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you click on the link in the description if you want to start making money right now with social media jobs. Just know you are appreciated. Mr. Bookman is now signing off.